Developing any video game is tough, even for the most experienced studio, and when things tend to get particularly rocky, higher-ups may be tempted to just can the whole operation and move on. There are certain situations where abandoning ship isn't just sensible, but necessary. Of course, pulling the plug can present a whole bunch of other problems like wasted cash and layoffs or lawsuits, which are obviously not ideal, but in the case of the 10 games we have to talk about today, we still think maybe they shouldn't have shipped. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games that really should have been cancelled. Number 10, Haze. The first 3 Time Splitters games received unanimous praise, which should have encouraged Free Radical Design to churn out another installment. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Rather than striking while the iron is hot, though, they decided to shift focus to a brand new IP called Haze. Much like Daikatana, this IP suffered from severe overhype from the get-go, with Ubisoft confidently calling it a Halo killer. When Haze suffered a year of delays, Free Radical reassured the masses that the extra time would allow them to tweak everything to perfection. Sadly, Haze was a disaster, so much so it was baffling why the creators had such faith in it. Due to the incomprehensible plot, janky action, underwhelming gameplay, and insultingly brief campaign mode, Haze made a strong case for the worst game of the year. Trying to get back in the saddle, FRD prepped Time Splitters 4, believing that'd be a safe bet. But after Haze's poor reception, publishers wanted nothing to do with them. Despite publishing for the Time Splitters sequel for 15 years, nothing came of it before the company shut down in 2023. Annoyingly, of course, if Free Radical had just stuck with Time Splitters from the beginning, this whole thing could have been avoided. Number 9, Turok. Turok Dinosaur Hunter centers around a time-traveling Native American who faces off against aliens and cybernetic dinosaurs. As stupid as that premise sounds, the cosmic shooter kicked off a thrilling and successful series. But after the brand suffered a pretty significant drop in quality and acclaim filed for bankruptcy in 2004, it seemed as though the dino shooting saga was extinct. Get it? Fortunately, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The following year, a new studio called Propaganda Games acquired the rights for the property, allowing them to work on a Turok reboot. Said to be the first chapter in a new trilogy, the project looked like it would reinvigorate the beloved franchise. Unfortunately, 2008's Turok was anything but a return to form. Though the graphics were impressive, it didn't make up for the fittingly prehistoric level design, lack of save points, infuriating bosses, inconsistent aim assist, and constant freezing. Even though Propaganda Games were hoping to make a name for themselves with this debut title, instead what happened was the franchise flopped and then was never heard of again, and we didn't hear of the company again either. So bad news for everybody. Number 8, Too Human. Silicon Knights has been responsible for some fantastic titles, including Legacy of Kain, Eternal Darkness, and Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. So what the heck happened to them? Well, the tragedy that befell the company can be summarized in the words, too human. Though a sci-fi RPG based on Norse mythology sounds pretty cool, the project had an uphill battle right from the start. Due to constant interference from Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft, the game kept getting delayed, and this redevelopment cycle ended up stretching out to 10 years. These setbacks caused the budget to balloon to $100 million, which was an astronomical amount at the time. Nevertheless, Silicon Knights weren't deterred in the slightest, believing Too Human would launch a trilogy. After the dud was criticized for its graphics, control system level design, and loading times, that dream ended then and there. But it gets worse. Silicon Knights were caught in a legal battle with Epic Games after misusing their Unreal Engine 3, forcing them to pay $4 million. Just to rub salt in the wound, SK had to destroy all of their games that used the engine, including Too Human. Due to scathing reviews, endless debt, and a lawsuit to boot, Silicon Knights ended up having to shut their doors, which is a massive shame given they clearly had the talent. Number 7, 007 Legends. When it comes to video game adaptations based on James Bond, none can contend with GoldenEye 007. Having said that, Eurocom released a few solid titles surrounding Ian Fleming's iconic character, including Nightfire and the GoldenEye 007 remake. And hey, the Quantum of Solace game wasn't great, but it was better than the movie. In 2012, the company was tasked with what should have been, or could have been their magnum opus, a game that was going to celebrate the entire legacy of James Bond. However, since 007 Legends release was meant to correlate with the 50-year anniversary of the first Bond film, the developers were forced to cut corners to meet the deadline. As a result, the finished product didn't exactly feel finished at all. The gameplay was uninspired, the graphics looked last gen, and the missions were abysmally designed. Save for the shoehorn Bond references, nothing about this clunker felt like a Bond property at all. Due to the absurdly rushed development, Legends also didn't even have an ending upon launch, meaning players had to wait for the DLC before they could complete the main campaign. The overwhelmingly negative reviews caused Activision and Steam to pull Bond titles from their catalogs. Just to be clear, these were Bond titles that this company didn't even create. Worst of all, the poor sales forced Eurocom to close shop less than 2 months later. If they didn't take the job in the first place, they probably would have still been going strong to this day. Number 6. Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness. Core Design seemed to have nothing but good intentions when they set about to put together the ultimately disastrous Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness. Being the first entry on the PS2, CD clearly wanted to utilize the system's hardware to push the franchise beyond what the PS1 was capable of. The company also performed market research to figure out the best way to approach the sequel. Unfortunately, it was obvious that this soft reboot was going to be a train wreck long before its release. Firstly, none of the original creators of Tomb Raider worked on Angel of Darkness. Due to the team's overambitious ideas, lack of management, and poor leadership, they actually had to start the project over again from scratch, which, delays inevitably. Even though planned sections were removed to ensure Angel of Darkness was released on time, it was all for naught. This trek was torn apart for its shoddy combat, constant frame rate dips, awful camera, and controls that felt more dated than the original. Angel of Darkness tarnished the series' name so badly that Tomb Raider wasn't considered a big-time brand again until it was rebooted a decade later. For this reason, it probably would have been better if Core Design never bothered with it in the first place. Number 5. Sonic the Hedgehog, 2006. By the millennium, there was no mistake Sonic the Hedgehog couldn't compete with Super Mario. Nevertheless, the ring-collecting hero was still a respected brand, featuring in great titles like the Sonic Advance trilogy and Sonic Adventures 1 and 2. But as the franchise's 15-year anniversary approached, Team Sonic decided this was their opportunity for a grand reboot. Despite how large the project was, the team behind Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 was tiny, since half the developers were working on a separate game at the time. Sega pushed for Sonic 06 to be released before Christmas, which gave the team zero time to finalize anything. Sonic co-creator and head of Sonic team Yuji Naka knew he was on a sinking ship since he walked out in mid-development. And the rest is history. Sonic 06 was an unmitigated disaster, suffering from unbearable loading times, visual bugs, and enough glitches and clipping issues to render it unplayable. What's worse is the stench surrounding this trash has followed the furry speedster ever since. Many former Sonic fans haven't revisited the series since, missing out on a bunch of great titles, including Sonic Colors, Sonic Generations, Sega All-Star Racing, and the masterful Sonic Mania. Considering how Sonic 06 turned out, you can see why it's the absolute gold standard of how one atrocious game can damage a brand just that much. Number 4. Ghostbusters, 2016. In 2016, Fireforge Games released an isometric 2.5D title simply called Ghostbusters, not to be confused with Ghostbusters the video game. Though the Ghostbusters reboot of the same year did generate a bunch of negative feedback, it was a masterpiece compared to this thing. On the surface, this adaptation looked like it had potential. While it takes after the events of the film, this Ghostbusters title carves its own path by telling a new story and following a different team of heroes. Also, it features 4-player co-op, which was an awesome idea, in theory. But due to the measly 8-month development cycle, it was obvious that this travesty was rushed out to coincide with the release of the movie reboot. Since the developers had no time to work on it, well, you can probably guess what happened. It was impossible for them to make a viable product, so the level design was lambasted, the gameplay was bad, the controls were bad, it was called completely tedious from end to end, and it cost $50, so a lot of unhappy campers. With Fireforge Games in debt of $12 million, the creators were liquidated a mere 3 days after Ghostbusters debuted. Number 3. Skull and Bones, Since the piracy sections in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag were a major highlight for the franchise, it seemed sensible to have the same team helm the tactical pirate title Skull and Bones. Even though the CEO Yves Guillemot promised that this was going to be a quadruple A game, and let's have a moment of silence for everyone at Ubisoft in the marketing and PR departments who had to deal with that fiasco, there were alarm bells from day dot for this one. The lack of management, conflicting ideas, and general disorganization led to a 6-year delay and the budget ballooning to $200 million. Even if the game made a ton of money, turning a profit seemed unfeasible. Sadly, the end result was worse than the biggest cynics expected. Despite the time and money put into it, Skull and Bones felt like an inferior version of Black Flag. The sailing and ship combat was fairly solid, but everything else was very bare bones. Despite offering a bunch of free trials, Skull and Bones drew less than 1 million players upon release. The fact that its competition Sea of Thieves sold over a quadruple the amount in the same time frame really added to Ubisoft's misery. Not only did Skull and Bones fail to make a profit, it didn't even come close to breaking even. Number 2, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. In the climax of Batman Arkham Origins, it was implied a Suicide Squad spin-off was on the horizon. However, that ship seemingly sailed in 2016 when WB Games Montreal announced on Kotaku that the project was scrapped. Rather than just leaving the property there, Rocksteady decided they'd have another crack at it, and so we got Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. At first, hearing the creators of the Batman Arkham games were headlining the spin-off sounded very reassuring. However, anticipation dried up pretty quickly as it was confirmed the game was gonna be a live service looter shooter. The promotions didn't help either, since the game looked like a Fortnite clone with a DC skin slapped on. When the demo showed off glitchy gameplay, repetitive action, and an excessive focus on crafting, the gaming community were confused as to why this dumpster fire hadn't been cancelled a dozen times over. Against all odds, though, we're happy to say, well, no, we're not happy to say, this game actually turned out to be even worse than even the most skeptical cynics assumed it would be. Even if it didn't have a disastrously buggy debut, which it did, there's simply not enough engaging content to keep the most devoted comics fans satisfied. At its peak, Kill the Justice League never had more than 14,000 players. Sometimes the numbers were only in the double digits. Number 1, Marvel Heroes. Marvel Heroes was a free MMORPG where the player could take control of over 100 iconic superheroes, including Captain America, Hulk, Iron Man, Spider-Man, and Wolverine. On paper, the comic book role player sounded like a guaranteed hit, but shortly into development, Cryptic Studios determined that Marvel Heroes was not on the same level as its competition. So then in 2008, they just cancelled everything. Even though Marvel Heroes should have died then and there, a new development team called Gazillion Entertainment came out of nowhere the following year and agreed to take over. Gazillion was so eager to work on the powerhouse IP, they signed a decade-long deal with Disney to create more Marvel games, including Marvel Superhero Squad Online, which massively underperformed. Even though Gazillion is fun to say and its confidence was admirable, it was unfortunately deeply misplaced. Due to the unsophisticated combat, repetitive gameplay, and limited customization, Marvel Heroes felt more like Marvel Zeroes. Youch. That might have been worse in the game. Despite pumping in over 80 million bucks and spending 4 years on the project, Disney closed down the servers 3 years after launch and terminated their deal with Gazillion. Just to really kick them when they were down, the company went into liquidation immediately after, causing all employees to be let go without severance pay or benefits. If the dead property wasn't needlessly resurrected, Disney and Gazillion could have saved themselves a lot of headache and a lot of dollars and jobs. Bummer.